we are going to move on to Mrs. Carla Ann Roper, who, as I said, has been one of the lead persons in terms of drafting the legislation for protecting the rights of persons with disability.
Between the strong and the weak, between the rich and the poor, it is freedom that oppresses and law that sets free. Just thinking about that, it would appear that it is an antithesis. It would seem that it's when you have freedom, everything should be okay. But on the converse, I have found that it is with this quote-unquote freedom that you can do almost anything you want, that is what restricts persons. And it is the fact that law exists that really gives true freedom to those who have issues and challenges as they continue during their daily lives. And that quote was from Lacordaire. When I came in through the doors this afternoon, I looked at the little presentation that was out, and one of the things that struck me was that it said that it was a human right. It's an intrinsic right for everyone, including the deaf, to be able to communicate. Communication is so important, and because of the fact that there may not be as much or as inclusive a communication strategy for the deaf, they are in fact being denied a basic human right. And so therefore, the fact of law is very important for the movement of persons within the disabled community and for our purposes today for the deaf community. In our country, we have a written constitution. Other countries such as the UK doesn't have a written constitution. Jamaica has a written constitution. And in chapter 3 of that constitution, it sets out what we call those fundamental rights and privileges of our population. Now this is a supreme law, meaning that this is the law above all laws. But what you find is that the language of the Constitution is so very wide, and it has to be, but in some instances, because of the wide manner in which it is drafted it does not give as much coverage as we would want. And hence, this is why when we set the framework from the Constitution that all persons have certain basic human rights, that we are now moving on to looking at taking out for the disabled community specifics in relation to a Disability Act. And that is what the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, that is a portfolio ministry with responsibility for the disabled community, is working on currently. We have the National Advisory Board for persons with disabilities that advises the minister on policy issues, and we have the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities, that is an agency under the ministry that works with all the disabled community to move forward, to empower the disabled, and in our case today we're speaking of the deaf. Starting with the policy, the National Policy for Persons with Disabilities, which was tabled in Parliament in 2000 and has been debated and discussed and by the policymakers or legislative personnel, our MPs and our senators. This policy, National Policy for Persons with Disabilities, sets out a framework within which the government is working to get all the disabled persons within our community included, feel more included in what is happening in our country. Now, that national policy, the main purposes were to give guidelines to government for the equalization of opportunities for the disabled in all aspects of life, to provide a framework for government agencies to cooperate in dealing with disability issues in the areas of their functional responsibility, to assist individual agencies to strengthen their capacities, and of course to assist in the implementation of the convention, which has already been discussed since we have been sitting here. Now, we have gone through the stages, and we are still continuing through the stages of this Disability Act that we are working on at the ministry. The main purposes that the Act will be trying to do is to promote, protect, and facilitate the full and equal enjoyment of all fundamental rights and freedoms by persons with a disability within Jamaica, promote the recognition and acceptance of the principle that persons with disabilities have the same rights as the rest of the community, as Dr. Louis Bell has already said, to promote individual dignity and individual autonomy, including the freedom of choice and independence, the full and effective participation and inclusion in society, and to ensure that persons with a disability have the same rights and equality before the law as any other person. In relation to that matter, I found it was very interesting in my research that the Constitution speaks specifically to persons who have been arrested or have been charged with criminal offenses to be provided as soon as is possible so that they are told what is the nature of the offense that they have been arrested in relation to or charged for. And that means in a language that they can understand. What we have found is that the whole issue of education and using the language that they can understand, we really need to be doing a little bit more training, not just, say, for example, for the teachers, but also in the various government agencies. The Justice Training Institute has put in place a program for the training of persons within the judicial system. A clerk of court who I know reminded me that she actually went on the training and actually saw how important it was when she was involved in a case where one of the litigants was a deaf person. And so that program, I think, is a good start in that regard. Now, in relation to the rest of the law, it will speak to being rights-based. And the difference between a rights-based legislation and other legislations you may have had is that it's very specific. It says you shall have the right to, instead of you should not. So what it does is sets out the framework to saying each person with a disability has the right to health facilities, to education and training, to employment, to being involved in their political and public life, to having access to premises and housing, having access to public transportation. We're looking at very important issues that touch and concern everyone in the society, but more so disabled persons who may be marginalized in relation to these inalienable rights that everyone is entitled to. Now, the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disability would be given legal statutory status in relation to their role and function, and they are basically going to be an implementing body to help to make sure that this law, when it is passed, all the necessary structures actually work. Also, one of the major points of this legislation will be prevention of discrimination on the basis of having a disability. So that will be very important, because discrimination would be considered any unfair distinction, exclusion, restriction on the basis of a disability, which has a purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying what the disabled person is supposed to have as a genuine right. Now, the process of the bill coming into effect is still continuing, because we have to draft in legalese to get all of this in a format that is available to go to Parliament. But what is going to be very important is the regulations under this act. Those regulations will make the nuts and bolts. They will be speaking specifically to the issues of, say, the sign language and how that is taught in this particular context. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to encourage the JAD and their constituents, the deaf community, to get involved in how it is that we put together these regulations, which will be the nuts and bolts to make the law work.
So the floor is open for question.
I've gone to a travel center, and I believe there was some kind of JUTC, and there were some difficulties going on that I needed information from. And from the media, I found, if there is the emergency, there were the troubles that we had, there needs to be the announcements, the emergency announcements listed on the screen so that I'm aware of what's going on, so that I can see what was going on. I know to go home, that there's a curfew, that the buses will be closed. So I know this information. These kind of barriers that I've recently experienced, I'd like removed. Oh, also, I would also like to add, we could set up a system where deaf people could sign up and have, like emergency notifications sent to their texts, so that if there's a hurricane coming or if there's troubles in a certain area, if you're signed up for the system, you would receive a text notice of that.
The Combined Disabilities Association is in dialogue with ODPIM, that is Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, regarding ensuring that disaster preparedness messages are text, and they have agreed to work something out with the phone companies to ensure that the messages that are, you can dial 116 on the cable and wireless telephone and hear the weather and all the warnings. So they are trying to ensure that this same information is sent on text, but that would only deal with the emergencies, like, as she mentioned, hurricanes, but not to do with the police. But we have not yet finalized our discussion on that, because we want to have another meeting and include the deaf community, where they will be able to articulate their needs.
This discussion was really timely and appropriate, and coming out of the discussion, we recognize the need for sign language, the Jamaica Sign Language, to be recognized as the major language, sign language, for communicating to deaf persons in Jamaica. We also have heard the need for not just education for deaf persons, but high quality education for deaf persons, because they have a right to high quality education just as anyone else. Also, the whole issue of the importance of the health service to the deaf persons, and that health care, the right to proper health care, is critical in terms of improving the quality of life for the deaf. We heard also from Dr. Roper and his presentation, where he pointed out the need for us to include closed captioning and sign language as a part of the whole broadcast of information to deaf persons. And some of the interventions that we heard from the floor and the recommendations that were made included the establishment of interpreters as a critical part of the professional cadre in terms of the government service. We have also heard individuals from the floor requesting for certain provisions to be put in place for transmitting information to the deaf community in the case of emergencies, and also for the emergency services to be more accessible in communicating with the deaf community. I am going to suggest that in light of this forum, Mrs. Suter, that we put together one or a two-pager to take to the National Advisory Board for its approval and ratification, so that the Ministry of Labor and the other partners can put it into action.
Next on the Susan